Hello everybody, this episode is going to be on the Lumetri Color Panel and color correction in Premiere Pro. I'm going to get a little bit more extensive with this and kind of explain quite a bit how everything works so you can kind of do some very nice cinematic looking color correction within Premiere. If you decide not to go to something a little bit more complex like DaVinci Resolve, a lot can be done within Premiere. Now to explain what the Lumetri color correction is inside of Premiere, if you go up to this little color tab right here and click on that, it's going to arrange everything for your color correction here. So if you go up to this little color tab here at the top and select that, it's going to arrange everything and set it up for color correction. And first of all, what the Lumetri color correction is it is a feature that has been brought over from SpeedGrade, which Adobe no longer supports. They brought those features over from SpeedGrade and kind of implemented them in Premiere for faster and better quality color correction. Well, the big thing about the Lumetri Color Panel, as opposed to their old legacy filters that they have put in the obsolete folder, if you go down to our little effects tab here and we go under our old video effects and you scroll down, you'll see this obsolete folder right here. And under obsolete, they have all their old color correctors that people used to use, because these things have kind of been moved over to these SpeedGrade type panels here that make things a lot faster. And also, one thing I want you to notice on these old obsolete color correction one is that some of them are these 32-bit float point color correctors, which means it accesses all the color channels on the clips that you're using. If you're using raw footage or footage with a lot of color information and large files, Premiere is going to access those. And some of these earlier filters did not access those, did not support 32-bit float point, and now the Lumetri panel brought over from SpeedGrade does that. So this reads all the original color information from your clips, and it maintains a very higher quality color correction than was previously capable in Premiere. With this layout here, what we've got is we've got, of course, our timeline down here and our program monitor. Up here, we've got another tab here that's called Lumetri Scopes. And when you first bring this up, it will probably look more like that. By default, I believe all the scopes are going to be up, but you can click up here and uncheck and take away certain scopes. We're going to talk about what these scopes mean over here and how you use those. And we're going to talk about this panel over here, which is all of your color correction, essentially, right here in this panel. One other thing about the way this layout is set up is as soon as you move to color, you'll notice as you move your playhead, you'll notice immediately that it starts selecting clips that the playhead is over. That is not the default for while you're editing. While you're editing, you have to actually manually select clips. But when you're moving this over a clip, you'll notice it selects it. And when you start moving things over here on the Lumetri panel, well, let's show you here. Because normally you have to select a clip to be able to add a filter to it. But if we go up to our effect controls here, notice we don't have anything but the native effects on here, which is basically our motion tab and opacity tab and time remapping. Let's collapse those. Each one of these are native to each clip, and anytime you select a clip, it shows those features right up here. It shows its effects right up there in the effects controls panel. But right down here under video effects, if we move down, if we actually search for it, search for Lumetri, it brings up a bunch of presets for Lumetri here. But one thing I want you to notice, if we close those, under the color correction tab, you'll notice there is this Lumetri tab. There's this Lumetri effect right here. As with any effects, you can simply grab these and drag them over and drop them onto a clip. And when I do that, notice it pops up over here. And now that effect has been added to this clip, and I can go in and start changing it. But you don't even have to do that when you're in color correction mode. If I'm going to delete this, I'm going to have my playhead over this clip here, and it's automatically selected it. Now watch what happens when I start doing something here. Let me grab the exposure and start changing the exposure. Notice it immediately added a Lumetri color effect over here. And just to kind of give you a rundown on how this works here, if we arrow down, let's see, right now we're under the basic correction tab. You can close these and collapse these, but just by simply clicking on these categories, and it brings over the basic correction. Over here, watch this, as I grab the exposure and start dragging it up, notice what happens. We grab the exposure and start dragging it back and forth. Notice what happens over here on the exposure slider over here in the effects tab. These are inseparably linked here. As we move up this the exposure here, it changes the numerical version over here on this filter on this side. So just so you know that it is adding, when you start moving these tabs here, it adds a Lumetri color effect to your clip, and it updates it over here based on these sliders right here. These sliders basically it's an expanded effect slider window to change the attributes on this Lumetri color effect over here. And if you're familiar with the effects inside of Premiere, you can make some changes here. Let's make a change and go super contrasty and overexpose this a bit. If we go over to this effect here on this tab, on this clip now, and we check this FX here, it turns it off, and we can look at the before and after by simply clicking on that little effects tab right there. It's the same with any of the effects that you add to any of your clips. I'm going to select that and delete it. So this essentially makes it very easy to do color correction within Premiere. So I'm going to do a quick overview of the Lumetri Color Panel over on this side, and then we're going to move over to the scopes and start discussing scopes and how those are used. So what we've got here is from kind of top to bottom a little bit of a workflow here, and I kind of wish they would put this creative panel toward the bottom because this seems more like a finishing touch sort of thing. But let's go to the first of all the basic correction, and what you've got under basic correction is you've got first of all this input LUT. Here, if you're working with a specific type of camera, you can put an input LUT, which is going to assume that this was shot on an Alexa or a Phantom or something else here. And what a LUT is, it's called a lookup table. It's already a preset color correction that's been created for a certain type of camera. If you click on this, it'll increase the gamma, or if it has something that's very flat, like a log footage, it'll make it way more contrasty. So depending on what you're shooting in, it's going to just kind of be at what's called an input LUT before you actually start color correcting. But in my opinion, this kind of is not going to be used all that much unless you're in a hurry, because you're going to be going for kind of ultimate control over your project. You've got your white balance here, and basically what this is to balance a shot. If a shot looks like it's off color, you've got your blue and red slider and your tint slider, your temperature and your tint slider, which does blue and orange and green and magenta. And this is to change the color temperature of the clips that you're working on. Down here, tone. Tone does not necessarily deal with color. It does to an extent, but when we talk about the word tone, it usually is referring to just brightness levels here. And then you've got exposure, contrast, your highlights, your shadows, your whites, your blacks, different areas that exist along the scale. We'll get into detail on that. And then, of course, you got your saturation slider for basic correction here on the bottom. The next tab down is creative. Creative has a bunch of looks, or what are also considered LUTs. These things are pre-built color correction filters here that you can apply to a clip and make it look a very specific way. You have an intensity slider to control that, and some basic adjustments here also to control these looks that you generate inside the Creative tab. Curves, we're going to be getting into this, but curves is so you can control brightness and contrast and individually control your red channel, your green channel, or blue channel. We're going to get into detail into that later as well. You also have a hue and saturation curve, which is kind of similar to this, where you have control over a specific color if you need to suppress it or increase the saturation on a clip. Color wheels. Those of you that have used speed grade and or actually Resolve, you'll be somewhat familiar with these here. You've got color wheels to control hue in your shadows, your midtones, and your highlights here. And these are actually tone sliders on the side. So you're going to have very specific control over those items, over the colors in your shadows, your midtones, and your highlights. A lot of control there. Your secondary color correction. Secondary is a really nice feature that they've added this past year inside the Lumetri panel. And what that does is it controls a very specific color vector. If you want to control the greens or the reds or the blues, and you just want to bring out the blues in the sky, you're going to be able to select a mask based on that sky and just correct the sky and nothing else. And then finally at the bottom is kind of a finishing tab called Vignette. Vignette is going to add a vignette around it, and vignettes have become very popular as of late in the last 10 years or so, where you can add a vignette around the outside. You can make them very obvious or kind of subtle just by grabbing your slider, and that is a bright vignette. And then you also have a dark vignette, which is way more common these days, which kind of brings the focus to the center of the image as opposed to something that might be overexposed out here on the side. That is a quick rundown on this. We'll get into more specifics a little bit as we start color correcting, but let's go over the scopes. I'm going to go up and click on the Lumetri scopes, and let's talk about what each one of these scopes will do. I'm going to uncheck all of these. First of all, let's go over the waveform. Now, what the waveform is used for is mainly for tone, for tonality or tone, as we say, which is basically your darks, your mids, and your highlights. The gray areas, the whites, and the darks in your image, not necessarily referring to color. Now, notice we do have some color here. This is blending what's called the red channel, the green channel, and the blue channel all together to create this waveform. This is not as commonly used this way. Usually, you can right-click on this and go, what I'm going to do is right-click on this and go under waveform type and tell it to show, instead of an RGB waveform, I'm going to tell it to show the Luma waveform. And this is down here under, you got parade type and you've got waveform type. I'm going to tell it to do the waveform type as Luma. Luma is going to show just an absolute brightness level of this clip right here. If you're going to take all the color out of this, let's take a look at this. I'm going to go by my saturation and drag it down all the way to 0. Right now, there is no color in this shot. And look over here. This scale has hardly changed at all. As I click undo, you see just like some kind of fill-in texture stuff here. But for the most part, this waveform has remained the same. This waveform is not here to necessarily read color as much as it is, once again, the darks, the grays in your image, and the highlights and the whites. And what this does is it measures all those it'll measure that image based on what's called an IRE scale. This is an IRE scale, and this is like the more international scale that's being used here. But they're pretty much the same. You just have to remember that 0 on the scale, on the IRE scale, and this international scale, basically the exact same point. And what you've got here at 100 on the IRE scale, and once again, this is kind of like more like a North American and South America sort of scale. This is set up by this scale is actually based on what they called IREs. An IRE basically means Institute of Radio Engineers. It's the standard that's been set up for measuring darks and highlights and grays, and they've measured it from 0 to 100, which kind of makes sense. I'm going to explain why. 100 is kind of where it stops, and 0 is where it begins here. And on the international scale, you've got 0, and it basically caps out at 255. And I say caps out, it goes higher than that, but we're going to talk about what these things mean here. And once again, this is measuring exposure levels on your screen from basically left to right, and you go over here and go left to right, and it's measuring the screen from left to right, or right to left if you wish. But anything here on the left side of the screen is measuring items here on the left. Anything in the middle is measuring things here in the middle. Anything on the right is measuring things on the right over here. And once again, is basically dealing with brightness levels. All right, I'm going to grab this playhead and move it along here and move it over to the side. Now look what's happening here. So let's explain what this scale is. At the very bottom here, 0 is where your darks are. This is basically where detail is lost in what we call the blacks on the screen here. If you have little darker areas like that, that is not quite all the way black here. I can tell because looking at the screen, there's nothing that's hitting around 0 here. As we get things that have been shot that are very heavy contrast, you might get them hitting close to 0, which means your details disappear when your scale starts hitting 0 in the blacks. And at 100, your details start disappearing in the highlights. Details will be gone once they hit 100. And notice this was not shot overexposed. The sky was a little bit overexposed here. And as we go from left to right here, the sky goes about that far over. If you go about the same distance over as you do on this screen here, it's showing that there's a strip of overexposure on this shot, and that is basically the sky. But it looks like kind of the mountainous area here is exposed properly right around like the 40 to 50 IRE range. It's probably a little underexposed, but as you get into kind of the 40 to 50 to 60 area, this is kind of your mid-range exposure right here. So let's go over to the Lumetri tab here, and let's start doing some things under the basic correction. I'm going to grab my black slider, I'm going to drag it, and look what happens as I start dragging this down. It's starting to define the blacks as more dark. As I drag these down, notice how they get darkened. As I lift them up, notice how they lift up. And this is telling me if I'm starting to lose detail. Usually your detail, you're going to bring it down to about like 5 IRE because you don't want to lose all that detail in the dark areas. And then as we grab our highlights and we drag that up, look what happens here. It's starting to bring the highlight region of my image up. And now it's starting to clip this and starting to lose detail in the whites. Let's bring the whites up as well. And we're going to really crush that. And now notice there's no more detail in the sky. In fact, if you maintain detail or sometimes bring down the exposure in the sky, you'll be able to bring back, if this is not diffused clouds, we'll be able to bring back some of the blue in that sky right there. And it looks like the detail's not being lost, so let's test that theory really quick. I'm going to go into my secondary. I'm going to select this sky area right there, make a color mask. We're going to show how this works later, but right now I'm just going to select that sky and see if we can kind of bring back some of the detail of the sky. And there, I've got that whole sky kind of selected there. Let me uncheck the color gray, and we're going to grab, and once I've got that area there I've got that area selected there, I'm going to grab my highlight and bring down the highlights in that region, and then I'm also going to grab my highlight here and move it over toward the blues, and look at that, we can pull some of the blues out of that right there, and there is some blue left in the sky. So that's what your waveform monitor is basically used for, is correcting tone, correcting the darks, the mids, and the highlights. And we'll be getting into that as we get into color correction. I'm going to delete that Lumetri Color Panel right there. Let's go to our parade here. The parade is kind of similar to a waveform. It is actually a waveform, but what it does, any image that you're working with video is going to be separated into three color channels. You've got your red channel, your green channel, and your blue channel. Almost any image that you work with that has color is going to basically have 3 different images composited into one. It has a red channel measured in your dark levels, your highlights, your mids, greens in your darks, your highlights, and your mids, and blues as well. And when you combine those all together, you get a composite image and an image that looks like a normally colored image. In fact, if you look online, you'll see several instances of this. You'll see several photographs that when they're combined together into a composite, they create a color image. But with the Lumetri panel, you're going to be able to control these things very individually. The red channel, the green channel, and the blue channel you can control individually. Now what the parade is used for, this is called an RGB parade. It's basically the waveform, the full-on waveform from left to right of the red channel, from left to right of the green channel, and left to right of the blue channel. And what you can do is you can kind of look at these and see if they are close enough together. Usually when these things are fairly in sync, your shot will be balanced. And what I mean by balanced is it will look fairly normal. Now if we move through our shots here and we look at a couple of these shots, we look at this shot right here of this guy standing on the ground. Notice the red channel, the green channel, and the blue channel. The green channel is a little higher, and then the blue channel is even higher than that. So what we end up getting is a heavier push in the blues, and we get kind of a cooler looking shot. As we move to the next shot, look at this. The red channel is a little more boosted than the green, and the blue is the lowest right there. So this shot is therefore a little bit more warm. And these shots aren't necessarily balanced, but as you go into basic correction and you slide these back and forth, you're going to be able to balance a shot. If you get these to where they kind of look very similar here, you're going to have what's considered a more balanced shot. Let's look at that before and after there. As I check mark this on and off, see that looks coolish, and this looks a little bit more normal there. And that's what the RGB parade is going to be used for, is mainly for balancing shots. So next one we've got here is a histogram. And honestly, the histogram is not used a whole lot inside of Premiere. There's a much better RGB histogram that you find in DaVinci Resolve that's actually quite useful, but usually histograms are used to measure luminance levels. And this does have the red channel, the green channel, and the blue channel, and also the gray channel here to show exposure. But what we've got is at the bottom, this is where pixels lose details in the darks, and you have very few pixels that are kind of losing details in the dark, barely starting to hit down here. And at the top you've got actually mainly your blue channel. The blue channel has some highlights that are being crushed in the blues here, that are overexposed in the blues. And that's probably, I imagine, somewhere along these rocks or something like that, where that looks a little bit too bright, but that's mainly in the blue channel. And histograms are really helpful actually while you're shooting. A lot of people will use them for exposure to make sure that they're not overexposing and losing details in the highlights. But I'm not really going to use this a whole lot in color correction. The ones that are most commonly used are going to be the waveform, the RGB parade, and the vector scope. Next, we'll move on to the vector scope and talk about the vector scope. And the vector scope HLS is a hue, luminance, and saturation vector scope. Honestly, this one is hardly used in color correction. It's one they've added from speed grade. Some people find it indispensable, but this is kind of one that have not used all that much. In fact, they don't even have this in DaVinci Resolve. The vector scope YUV is the more common vector scope. Bring that up, we'll talk about that a little bit. And what a vector scope is used for, especially this YUV vector scope, is used for two major items. It's used for hue, measuring hue, and saturation. And hue is your basic color balance. If you have an image where it looks like we've got some blue right there, and actually this has a kind of a mirrored item down here on these wheels. This is basically a representation of all the colors in your image here. And if you look at over one of these wheels right here, you've got kind of this red, green, you've got kind of this red, then you move into yellow, green, cyan, blue up here, magenta as you get up there toward the top, and red at the top right there. And this is basically a representation of this wheel right here, of that color wheel. And you have your red point, your yellow point, your green point, your cyan point, your blue point, and your magenta point. Like I said, we're mainly dealing with the RGB channels here, but in between those, as you start to blend those together, you're going to get cyan, and as you're blending red and green, you're getting magenta, and as you're going between your red and green, you're getting your yellows. So this basically shows a concentration of pixels in two different manners here. We show that we've got some blue hue, kind of cyan, between blue and cyan hue going off here, and that's probably the shirt. But this also shows saturation. It's kind of showing a point out here that's starting to recommend that you stop saturating a clip. If it gets starting going out toward this point, this is a recommendation for where your saturation begins, and this is actually a warning point that this is where your saturation should end. Notice as we grab our saturation here and we drag it up, that the hue stays the same. It still has a little bit of reds and a little bit of yellows and some blues, but now they've boosted out from the center point. This center point represents no saturation. If we grab the saturation, drag it and look at the scope, what it does, it sucks everything into the middle till there's a little dot. And that means there is no color in this shot. As we start to boost this out, notice the hue angle stays the same. It's staying out toward the reds and the blues, but it's just how much color there is. The hue is the same, the basic color balance is the same, but the saturation is increasing. If we go to these color wheels, we can change the hue angle, move these around, and notice we're changing our hue angle and changing the way the color looks, and we're getting these pushes more toward blue, magenta, and reds. And that's what the vector scope, that's what the YUV vector scope is used for. It's kind of setting legal limits on saturation and also determining what type of color you have in a shot. Now, a lot of people may say that they can just kind of eyeball it and they can get their color correction in check and make it look good. But what the scopes are really used for, they're kind of a little bit more professional. When you're using the scope, this is showing very accurate colors and very accurate brightness levels when you're using these different scopes here. And every monitor that you work on is going to be slightly different one from the other. You can calibrate them so they're pretty close, but oftentimes you really need to have scopes to back you up when you are actually doing color correction. And you are, of course, going to need your eyeballs just to kind of look at it, make sure that things match as it cuts from shot to shot. So let's get into the color grading process now using the Lumetri panel. First of all, let's talk about the color grading process here. This is kind of the process here for color grading. First of all, the two major goals for your project is going to be legality and matching shots. And what I mean by legality is you've got those scopes, you need to use them to show if your darks are getting too crushed, if your highlights are getting too blown out, or if your saturation is going too high. You got to adjust them according to the waveform monitor, the IRE scale, or the vector scope on the saturation. Make sure you're not exceeding saturation limits or brightness or crushing your darks or your highlights. So that's one thing you're going to watch with legality. And then matching, of course. What you're going to be trying to match is what's called HSL, hue, saturation, and luminance. As you cut from shot to shot, you want your shots to be balanced in hue, you want your saturation to be consistent, and you want your luminance and your contrast to be consistent as well. So you're going to be matching from shot to shot to shot. And the first process, and this is part of legality and matching, is primary color correction. Your primary color correction is a global grade that you're going to be doing, meaning you're adjusting the entire shot, you're adjusting the hue, saturation, and luminance. Usually after you get the first shot done, you're going to try to match all other shots to that shot. Once you get the way the hue you want it to be, saturation, luminance you want them, the way you want that to look, then you're going to match shots for the rest of the scene typically. And this is kind of the process here. And you're going to start with adjusting tone. You're going to adjust your darks, your highlights, your exposure, and your contrast. It's all part of adjusting your tones. Then you start working on color. The first process of adjusting your primary color correction is balancing. You're going to make sure that your shots are balanced, meaning that the white balance looks proper, that the color looks proper, looks like it was shot. It doesn't look too blue or too orange or too yellow. The shot looks normal to our eyes. And then, of course, you're going to match that color from shot to shot as mentioned. But the primary color correction is basically divided up into those two major categories there, adjusting your tones and messing with your hues and saturation. And that's this category here is hue and saturation. After you're finished with primary color correction, you're going to move on to secondary color correction. Secondary color correction is where you choose a specific color by a vector. You choose it actually by HSL, by hue, saturation, and luminance. Say you just want to mess with the reds or the greens or the blues. Say you want to adjust the blues in the sky. Part of secondary color correction is first of all making those colors pop. If you want to bring out the colors a little bit more, and also part of secondary color correction. Say you've got like a yellow shirt that's just too yellow. You are going to suppress certain oversaturated colors by selecting that color vector. And then the last part of color grading is finishing. There's a lot of parts to finishing. There's actually sizing and panning and tilting and a whole bunch of other features, but we're going through the basics here. Finishing is right here. We're going to be talking about adding vignettes if necessary, and kind of a major one is look, adding a very specific look to your film, which you're going to finalize once everything has been balanced, once everything has been matched, then you're going to be adding a look to your film. And that is the process. Let's get started. So based on the process that I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to start here at the beginning of this. We're going to start at the beginning of this timeline here, and I'm going to start with my waveform here. I'm going to turn off my vector scope and just look at my waveform. And look at the waveform here. We've got a large amount of signal that's between kind of 10 and 70 IRE, which means this is what we would call a fairly flat image, meaning that your brights and your darks are kind of close together. They're not really spread further apart. When you spread them further apart, that is called contrast. When you take your highlights and bring them up, and take your darks and bring them down and spread them further apart, it creates contrast. We're going to go into the basic correction wheel wheel here, and let me show you what that kind of looks like. When we grab contrast, watch my waveform, and I grab my contrast and drag it to the right. It spreads those further apart, and it creates more of this contrasting kind of cinematic image here. But we're going to do some very specific correction on this. I'm going to undo that. I'm going to grab my exposure and kind of mess with my exposure first of all under my tone here. I'm going to get my exposure right about where it looks good, and that's looking good right about there. I brought some of the mids to the 40 to 60 range, which is a good exposure range. And now I'm going to grab contrast and I'm going to drag that apart here and get a little spread further apart. And I spread that out, and it's giving a more of a contrasty image. If you want to look at the before and after, this is the before and after. You can kind of see how it brings out a little bit more detail there. It emphasizes the detail, rather. Now I'm going to grab the highlights. If you want to make highlights pop, usually if they're hitting 100, you'll want to bring them down a little bit. Now, the way this works inside of the Lumetri Color Panel is the highlights are the region around like 70 to 90. So let's go over this. So exposure is kind of the region between maybe like 40 to 60, maybe 30 to 70, kind of that region there, the mid region. The highlights are kind of the region like around 70 to 90. And the whites are going to be the area from 90 to 100. The shadows are going to be this region, kind of like the 30 to maybe 10 region down here that you're adjusting, and the blacks are going to be the very, very bottom right down here from 10 to 0. So one thing about making things look cinematic is you want a good wide contrast without crushing the details, and you can do that by let's grab our blacks here. I'm going to grab my blacks. I'm going to bring them down. I'm not going to quite hit 0 because I don't want to start crushing detail on 0 right there. And let's try the whites and bring those up and see what we get a little bit. And we get kind of a little bit more pop kind of in the whites of the water there, and we're getting a good contrast spread between these here. We can kind of mess with the shadows if we want to add more contrast, and with the highlights as well, and add a little bit more contrast. And now let's kind of look at our image here. I'm going to check mark this on and off and take a look at it. And we've got a nice spread there on our waveform, and we've got the exposure exactly where we want to. So now the next thing I'm going to work on here, now that I've got those adjusted and I've kept them within legal limits, I'm going to right click on this and we're going to go to Parade next. And the Parade is what I'm going to use to balance an image. And as I look at this image here, it looks like my red channel, my green channel, and my blue channel are pretty much in parity. Does parity mean matched? Let's see. Parity, not party. Yes, I was right. I'm smart. So as we look at this, our red channel, our green channel, our blue channel, they're fairly matched. So this shot is fairly balanced. We'll show you some examples of shots that aren't very well balanced and how to balance those things. But you're going to use these sliders right here. So as that is fixed, now we can probably work a little bit with our saturation. Let's go to the vector scope next and look at our saturation. So we looked at our waveform, we looked at our RGB parade, and now we're going to look at our vector scope. And here it does look like we got kind of a little bit of a warmer shot here. We do have some reds and yellows going off, mainly from the rocks there, so it's kind of a natural color anyway. But let's grab, I'm going to go down to our color wheels here. I'm going to grab my midtones, and just to see what happens here, I'm going to grab my midtones and move it over more towards the blue. And actually, that's kind of killing off a little bit of that warmth there, and it's starting to look actually a little bit more natural to me. This is one way you can do it with the color wheels. I'm actually going to reset that by double-clicking on this. And I'm going to go up to basic correction. Let's mess with the sliders as well. You can kind of achieve the same results. As I drag this over to the blues, look what happens to my vector scope. It's bringing more of a blue hue to this, and it's actually cooling it off a little bit. And actually, that does look a little bit better to me. Now that I'm seeing from my vector scope, I'm a little red and yellowish there. It's taking it a little bit over to the blue, and that looks a little bit more natural to me. So I did use my little white balance slider there. And as I check mark this on and off, I'm actually really liking the way that's looking. So as we go into the next shot here, let's look at our next shot. And this shot is looking completely different than the first shot. So let's work on matching that shot. A couple ways of doing that, of matching a shot. I'm going to go up to a window. I want a comparison here. I want to be able to do a side-by-side comparison. I'm going to go into window, and I'm going to pull up my reference monitor. My reference monitor pulls it up down here. I'm going to grab it and drop it up by my scope here. I'm going to drag it right in the middle here, let go, and it adds that as another tab. Now this is its own, this brings a timeline in its own window that is controlled independently of this timeline down here. This has its own playhead here, and notice it doesn't adjust anything down here. So I'm going to move this back to this shot right here, and I'm going to try to match this shot to this shot right here. I'm going to use this as, well, a reference. So I'm going to go to my Lumetri scopes. First of all, I'm going to do the same thing and try to get this kind of legally matched and kind of match contrast. So now looking at this shot here, we're going to go over here, and this does have kind of a flat feature just like the previous one. So what I can do is I can grab my exposure, bring up my exposure a little bit, grab my contrast, spread that out a little bit, grab my darks, bring them down a little bit and almost touch 0, bring my highlights up, and this is looking a little too bright, so I'm going to bring my whites down. Let's bring my highlights down as well and get the exposure up a little bit. So right there's looking pretty good as far as my brightness. Let's go to our reference monitor and look. Kind of looks like the same, but the color is a little bit different. Let's look at my RGB parade. And notice the red is a little bit higher than the blue here. And if I go to my vector scope as well, that's probably going to tell me much of the same here. Yep, and I do have a push over to the kind of the red. So I'm going to grab this. Let's go to my reference monitor. And I'm going to grab this and kind of pull it down till I get that to match on this screen here. Match from shot to shot there. And that's looking pretty good. And those look like they're fairly matching there. Now, one other thing I can mess with these in these shots is, of course, saturation. If we boost up the if we want a little bit more color here, we can boost the saturation. I can grab the saturation slider and drag it up, and it's going to boost the colors that already exist in there. I'm going to take that all the way up to kind of show you the extreme here. And you can see that kind of blooming out here and getting toward these kind of suggested like oversaturated points. So I'm going to drag that back a little bit, but I am going to give a little bit more saturation just to give a little bit more color to this shot. And I'm going to move back to this shot and kind of do the same thing. Grab that saturation, drag it up, and bring up the exposure a little bit. And now let's play through this and see if it looks like it matches from shot to shot. This looks like it needs a little bit more blue, and I can tell that by my RGB parade here. Watch this first shot. See how the blues are pushed up a little higher. Then we cut to this shot. And now I got my blues up a little, probably a little too high. I'm going to eyeball that a little bit. Get it right there. Let's play through it. And that's starting to look pretty good to me. So this shot is very obviously underexposed. So of course we're going to do the same grading process where we bring up the exposure, create the contrast, and so on. But notice this shot here, it has more warmth on the RGB scale, a little more green. So we can adjust that by playing with the sliders here. Let's bring the green down a little bit. And bring the blue around until we get a little bit more of a balanced shot there. All right, but I'm going to go on to some shots that are obviously mismatched here. Okay, here's a couple shots that were done with two different cameras. This one was done with a red camera here, and this one was done with a Sony f3 camera. So the Sony was obviously a little, the color balance was a little bit different than it was here on the red camera. This one looks a little bit more natural. So let's work on both these shots. First of all, I'm going to start with my red footage because that one is closer to what I want. So I am going to start with my waveform here. I'm going to look at this shot. Once again, it's very flat. I'm going to grab the exposure and bring it up a little bit. Kind of get that exposure that's kind of skin tone over into the medium exposure range there. Now I'm going to grab my contrast and spread out my contrast a little bit. Let's look at our parade here and see if the shot is balanced. Looks like it's got a bigger push in the reds and a little lower push in the greens and then a kind of a higher peak in the blues here. So let's start messing with this. I'm going to bring the greens up to meet kind of the top of the reds there. And we're going to mess with the blues there a little bit. And look at this. It looks like the mid-range of the blues, we're not going to get there by using this. So now I'm going to introduce you to curves and show you how curves work. Under curves, you have a tone curve right here, and then as you select any of these dots here, you've got your red channel, your green channel, and your blue channel that you can edit on a curve. And what we mean by curve here, this is a straight line. This means your shot is coming in neutral. Down here, you can look at this as your dark node. Up here in the top hand right, this is your highlight node. Down here, this is your dark corner, and up here is your bright corner. And then everything in between is going to be considered the mid. So it starts out black here, and it starts moving up to the grays, and then gets up to the white up here. Is the way this line works. So if we grab this dark node right here and we grab it and drag it over to the right to the dark area, it's going to bring down those darks until it just crushes them. And then eventually notice the highlight to the last thing that's bringing down because it's on this straight up line here that's bringing all the mids down toward this dark region, and then the highlights are staying right there. So if we bring down this highlight, you'll notice it'll start bringing down the highlights first until everything is crushed basically. And if we grab this node, drag it over to the left, it brings up the whites. And as we drag this dark up here, it brings up the darks and brings them up to the very top until they're blown out. So why they call these curves is because you can add nodes on these. You can have very specific controls over the darks, the mids, and the highlights by creating what's called a curve. We're going to click down here toward the bottom and click up here toward the top. We've added two nodes. Now if I grab this one, notice as I move this over, it creates this curve. So it means that it leads the dark region, the darkest region, alone, while bringing down kind of just a little bit higher of the darks. You go up a little bit higher in the darks and it starts bringing these darks up here. If you slide this up here, you're going to notice it changes. We're pulling down the mids Let me grab these darks and leave those alone, and we're just going to bring down like the mids. If you have too extreme of curves, you can see you start getting polarization and it starts destroying it. But if we add, normally what these curves are used for is that we bring down the darks just a little bit, we can bring up the highlights a little bit as well, and we create contrast. We create contrast without destroying the darks and without destroying the highlights, and that's basically what this is called an S curve, and that's what we're doing. But in this instance, I'm not going to use it just so much for contrast as much as adjusting this blue channel here to try to get this shot balanced. It is already fairly balanced, but I'm going to go to my blue channel here because I want to bring this section of my blue up to kind of meet the mids on the red and the green. So what I can do now is grab maybe a midpoint right here and start dragging up and seeing where that happens. You can see that it's bringing up the mid section of the blues without bringing up like the highlights and the darks. And that cools it off a little bit. It boosts those mids and the blues, and it cools it off so it's not so warm. And now it's starting to look a little more balanced. And that's where the curves are really handy. You can do this individually with the red channel if you want, and bring down the reds. And notice how it's just adjusting the reds and not the greens. I'm going to double click and reset that red there. And you can do this with the greens as well. And then you can grab the mids, the lower regions of the green, the highlights of the green, and change that as well and have very specific control over it. Now what this hue and saturation curve is down here is this is for adjusting, this is for suppressing or boosting a certain color vector. And you can go down here and choose which one you want to start with. Say we want to mess with the reds here. I'm going to click on the reds, and notice it adds 3 nodes here because it's going to create a curve. You can grab this middle node right here and drag this down, and it's going to take the reds, this red region, all out of the shot, and it's starting to, and you can see that that's getting a little less. And that you can see that has taken the reds out of it without affecting the blues, yellows, and everything else. Or, let me undo that, and you can see the change come back, or I can grab this and boost it up, and watch how his ears are getting super red there. It's starting to take the red that's in the shot and boost those up and saturate them. I'm going to double click on that, reset it, and you can go to blue, do the same thing. You can bring down the blues, you can boost up the blues, and mess with the saturation in those shots. I find myself not using this as much, especially since they added the HSL secondary. We'll talk about that in a bit. Now that this shot is almost balanced, actually I'm going to grab the highlights on his face and kind of bring those down so it brings a little bit of the skin tone back. Let's actually try it on the whites here. Bring the whites down and the highlights down a little bit, and there we go. There we go. Okay, let's say that's the shot I want to match right there. So I'm going to bring that up in my reference monitor, and I'm going to go to the previous shot, and now look how different these are. I want to get this one here to match to that one. And how I'm going to do that is I'm going to go to first of all, the Lumetri scope. Let's do the same rules here. I'm going to go to my waveform, and we're going to adjust our waveform here. I'm going to grab the darks and bring those down a little bit. My exposure is looking fairly good. It looks like it's about where I want it to be exposed. I'm going to bring down the whites a bit, bring down those kind of hits on the rocks there and the highlights, and keep the exposure up a little bit. Now we can add some contrast to this, spread the contrast out a bit. And then next, let's go to my RGB parade, and let's look at this. And look how the balance, the blue is way off from the green and the red here. I'm going to do a little bit of adjustment on these sliders here. I'm going to bring the red, boost the red up, and already you can see that's starting to get better. And I kind of want to bring those blue highlights down a little bit. Right there is looking somewhat balanced. Let's mess with the green and see what we get. There we go, right about there. I'm going to go to my curves, and I'm going to select the blue channel, and I'm just going to bring down the highlights of the blues to get those to kind of match here. Let's do a little bit of a curve. Warm that up a bit, and let's go to our reference monitor. And we're getting closer, but now we can use this to kind of match and get those a little bit closer. And use my color wheel and adjust that a little bit, and there we're getting a bit closer. So let's look at the before and after on that shot. So I'm going to go into my effect controls, and I'm going to turn this on and off, and look at the difference that we've got there. And let's play through it and see if it looks like it matches as it cuts from that shot to the next. That's looking a lot closer match. Still needs a little bit of tweaking, but that's a lot closer than it was before. So far we've gone through the basic correction, we've gone through the curves, we've gone a bit through the color wheels here, and the reminder just on the color wheels, you have a tone slider for your shadows, a tone slider for your mids, and a tone slider for your highlights, as well as a hue wheel here as well for each section. So you have some very specific control. I've covered the main sections of the color correction here. What I'm going to do is let's talk a little bit about secondaries. All right, so let's work on this shot right here. Because one thing I've noticed on this shot is the sky is basically kind of blown out, it's gone. But if you look at our IRE here, it is saying that there's still detail in the sky. So we can find out if that's true here. So I'm first of all going to do some basic adjustments to this shot. I'm going to go to my waveform here and kind of look at the waveform. And I'm going to mess with the exposure first of all, see where we need to get the exposure on the mountains there, and I'm going to add some contrast and spread that out. And I don't want to really hit 100 because I don't want to lose the detail in the sky. I'm going to bring down the blacks here and get a little bit more contrast. And now I'm going to bring down the whites a little bit because that's kind of the sky right there. But let's see if there's anything left in the sky. So after we've done some basic adjustment, actually let's work at our RGB here as well and do some adjustment there just to get this thing a little bit more balanced. And the mountains look a little bit better there now. Bring up the exposure a teeny bit. And now let's work on HSL secondary. The HSL secondary, let's see if we can kind of pull some detail out of the sky here and make it a little more blue. Because this says that it's not blown out. It's not 100 IRE natively here. So I'm going to hit under my HSL secondary. We're going to choose a vector of the sky here based on hue, saturation, and luminance. You have these sliders to kind of adjust those with kind of fall offs here, and we're going to show you. I'm going to hit this little plus, this set color plus button. I'm going to bring it over to the sky, click on the sky, and it says it has chosen a little section of the blue here and a little kind of range of blue there. And based on its saturation, you can kind of see that blue color that's selected, and this is where the saturation lies on what it has chosen. And this is where the luminance, how bright that blue is, right over here. If you really want to see what you've selected, you can check mark this color gray matte right here. And it grays out all the stuff that is not going to be adjusted and puts in and brings the color and gives you the available color that you are going to be adjusting. It looks very white right now, but I'm going to increase, what I'm going to try to do is get as much of the sky as possible. I'm going to increase my hue there, and that's grabbing a little bit more. And what this little triangle here is, this is kind of the fall off. This is kind of feathering off the edge of this range of blue. I'm going to choose a saturation as well, and look at that. We can almost choose all the sky. There's actually some clouds in the sky, so we probably want to leave a little bit of detail of the clouds in, maybe just to make it look natural, make it not look so blue all over. So we can leave some of those clouds in. And let's mess with the luminance here and see what we get. And luminance isn't changing a lot. It looks like it's kind of saturation and hue that's giving us more of the change in here. So we're going to try that. Now down here you have some ways to refine that mask. And actually what I'm going to do, instead of color gray, I'm going to show color black just to really see what I'm getting. The black is what's going to be is what it's going to not adjust. It's not touching anything in the mountains, and it's touching the regions up here that are white are the regions it's going to be hitting the most. The grays are kind of hitting it kind of halfway. Okay, so down here you got some things to help clean up that mask a little bit. We've got denoise. You can see a little bit of noise here, and as we grab this and drag it over, it's going to clean up some of that noise in there. I'm going to pull that over, be a little bit aggressive with that. And now I'm going to grab the blur, and this will soften that matte a little bit and kind of blur the pixels together to make it not such a hard-edged matte. And now that I've got kind of a little blurred section there, I've kind of refined that matte. I'm going to uncheck this, and now we're going to go down to correction here. Okay, so let's start adjusting down here. I'm going to the correction. You have access to the three wheels, to the shadows, the midtones and highlights, or just this one overall global wheel. And I'm going to mess with this first of all. I'm going to grab the hue wheel and start dragging it down to the bottom right. And you can see a little bit of blue kind of coming back. I'm going to grab the that region of the mask and drag it down a little bit and see what we get. That's not quite getting it yet. Let's go to the color wheels down here, and we're going to drag that over, and there we go. Now we're starting to add some blue back to the sky right there. I'm going to grab the tint and kind of bring that down, and there we go. Now we're starting to get some good strong blue back into the sky. Let's look at kind of the before and after. There's before, there's after, so we get kind of this white sky that's like blown out, and then we bring back some of the blue in the sky there. So that's where secondary color correction is helpful. Let me show a different instance of that. Here at the end here, let's say we want to control the oranges on this a little bit. So let's first of all do our basic fixes on our shot here. Gonna go to our basic correction. Okay, so let's grab our exposure, drag our exposure, bring it down. Let's bring our highlights down to kind of make those rocks not pop so much. Actually, let's grab our whites, bring those down and adjust this. Let's go to our Lumetri scopes and look at that. And look at the zeros are being kind of crushed there, so I'm going to bring up the blacks. Oh, and actually that's my little graphic there. So I'm going to turn the graphic off and really just take a look at this shot right here. Let's bring the darks down and add some contrast to this a little bit. Okay, now let's say we want to work with the orange. Either maybe we want to suppress it or make it pop here. I'm going to go under my HSL secondary. I'm going to click on this plus, select the orange, and now it's got that orange range. Let's look at our matte here that's creating, and let's adjust the matte, try to get as much of that orange as possible here. Yeah, that saturation's really bringing it out. And let's grab the luminance, and that's grabbing a bit of it as well. So now we've grabbed enough of that. Let's take a look at our key there. You actually got those glasses in front, so those are kind of blocking them. Let's denoise a little bit, and let's blur that mask a little bit. Soften it up a little bit. And there we go. And it's actually eating into the letters, so let's kind of back that off a little. Let's back those off a little bit there. And there we've got a good selection of that orange there. Let's turn that off, and now we can control that specifically. If we go down here, we can grab we could actually grab this bottom one, which is actually saturation. Hopefully they'll update that. It says sharpen, but this is actually saturation. So notice as we drag it down, it basically turns, it goes desaturated. As we drag it up, it boosts the orange here. So if we want to boost the orange, we can actually just boost up the saturation a little bit and make that kind of pop. And there we go. And actually that looks pretty good. Or we can just grab this, if we want to really boost it up, look at this. We can add a ton of orange to it, but that is getting oversaturated. But just to show what we can do. Let's check mark that on and off and take a look before and after. See how that just brings out the orange on that case. And there you go. Okay, so for finishing, let's talk about finishing now. Once we've done secondary color correction on shots, one thing you can do, kind of a little trick here, is I'm going to go under my project window here. I'm going to go full screen over this by hitting tilde. I'm going to go down to this bottom new item here and click on a new adjustment layer. I'm going to create an adjustment layer based on the same resolution and settings of the timeline. I'm going to, let's go to my timeline, hit Shift negative to bring this down. I'm going to grab this adjustment layer. I'm going to put it on top of everything. You can do this scene by scene, or you can do it for your entire movie, but I'm going to drag this over the entire top because we're going to add a look to this. Now as I move over some shots here, I can select my adjustment layer here, and now I can start doing Lumetri colors on my adjustment layer. And if you go under Creative, this has some already pre-built looks here. You can kind of arrow through this. I'm going to tilde over this here and make it full screen. And I'm going to start arrowing through these looks here and seeing if there's anything that I like. I kind of like this look right here. Let's take a look at what that is. This is my Fuji Real 500D Kodak look here. You can just keep arrowing through these and take a look at different looks until you find something that you like. And let's say I like this shot right here. All you have to do is double click and it adds that to the adjustment layer. Now everything under that adjustment layer has that look applied to it, and you can actually fine tune this look by going up to intensity, and you can turn down the intensity, and you have some other items here to increase your sharpness of your image, vibrance of the colors, and saturation as well. So you can kind of get that look fine-tuned exactly how you like it. I'm going to turn that on and off really quick. There's the before, there's the after, so it's kind of added this look, and it's added it to the entire shot. Let's go to the end here, and we've got kind of the same look added to that the entire project here. And if you want to add different looks, you can actually just hit C and cut your adjustment layer, and now you can do one look for this section here and one look for this section here. I'm kind of finalizing things here. We can add a vignette to our entire project if you want to as well on that adjustment layer. I'm going to select the adjustment layer, make sure I'm adjusting that. I'm going to grab my amount here and drag it to the left here and drag just a slight vignette around the edge to kind of bring focus to the middle there. And we can feather that off here. If we turn the feather off, you can see that kind of hard edge where that vignette begins and ends. And if I grab that and turn it up a little bit, and let's turn that on and off, kind of look at the difference there. It's just added kind of a darkened edges around the corner, so you're concentrating on the look there. And that's kind of in a nutshell how the Lumetri Color Panel works. It's got some very powerful features. It works really well with high quality footage and grades really fast. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them and I'll try to get back with you. Thank you.